Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the kinds of questions you might find yourself typing into a search bar late at night. You know the ones. With a little help from Psychiatrist Dr. Eric Bender, we're going to get some clear, expert answers to some of the biggest questions out there about our own mental health. So, let's get into it.
We are kicking things off with a question that, let's be honest, comes from a place of pure terror. That sudden chest tightness, your heart pounding, you can't seem to catch your breath. It's that moment where you think, what is happening to me? This is exactly the kind of urgent, real-world question we're here to unpack. So here's our game plan. We're going to move through 5 key areas. First, we'll start by decoding our inner world, just to get the basics down. Then, we'll explain some very common but often confusing feelings. After that, we're looking at your brain on, well, pretty much everything. Then, we'll explore some real pathways to feeling better. And finally, we'll zoom out to look beyond the individual mind and see the bigger picture.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, decoding our inner world. Because before we can really get into things like panic attacks or depression, we got to make sure we're all on the same page with a few key terms.
First up, you've heard the words, but what's really the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? Well, it all comes down to their training. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor, an MD, which is why they're the ones who can prescribe medication. A psychologist, on the other hand, really zeroes in on psychotherapy and other talk-based treatments.
Okay, next, let's talk about a word we hear thrown around a lot, psychotic. What does that actually mean? Well, clinically, it describes a break from reality. This means someone might be experiencing things that other people aren't, like hearing or seeing things, or holding on to beliefs that aren't based in reality. And here's what's absolutely crucial to get. The clinical definition of psychosis has nothing to do with being a criminal or being dangerous. That's a huge misconception.
So, where did this field even come from? Well, you can trace the roots of formal psychiatry back to the 19th century. Back then, there were doctors called alienists who worked with people who were, for different mental health reasons, alienated from society. Fast forward to 1895, and you get Sigmund Freud publishing his Studies in Hysteria, which many people see as the birth of modern psychoanalysis.
Okay, now that we've got some of the basics down, let's move into our second section, common feelings explained. We're going to get into the why behind some of these experiences that you've probably heard of, or maybe even felt yourself.
Let's talk about just how deeply depression can affect our ability to think. I mean, it can cause serious memory loss and even slow down our brain's processing speed by up to 40%. 40%! So why does that happen? Well, the science is pointing to a lack of glutamate, which is a really key neurotransmitter our brain absolutely needs to form new memories.
So let's circle back to that terrifying question from the beginning. Panic attack, heart attack, what is it? A panic attack is abrupt. It feels like it comes out of nowhere, hits its peak within minutes, and often brings on those really intense physical symptoms. An anxiety attack, though, is different. It usually builds up more gradually, and you can often link it back to a specific stressor, like a huge test you have to take or a big presentation at work.
You ever have one of those random, weird, or even upsetting thoughts that just gets stuck on repeat? Well, here's a look at what's actually happening in your brain. Normally, one part of your brain sends out a little worry signal, and then another part quickly sends back a hey, stop signal. But in obsessive-compulsive patterns, that stop signal is really weak. It's kind of like the brakes on the worry train have failed, and the thought just keeps looping and looping.
And you know, that idea of a feedback loop is the perfect transition into our third section, your brain on everything. Because it's not just our internal wiring that creates these loops. The external stuff we consume, especially on social media, can shape our minds in some really powerful ways.
We have to talk about social media. A recent study looked at hundreds of mental health videos on TikTok and found something pretty staggering. 84% of them were misleading.
And if you dig into that, it gets even worse. Nearly a third of those videos contained information that was just plain wrong. And here's the most concerning part. 14% of them offered advice that could actually be harmful. When they looked at who was making these videos, only 9% had any relevant qualifications. So the takeaway here is you have to be so careful about where you get your information online. Okay, let's switch gears and look at the chemical messengers inside our own brains. You've got neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin that send these super fast messages. Dopamine is all about joy, motivation, pleasure. Serotonin helps with mood and anxiety. Then you've got hormones, like oxytocin and endorphins. They travel through your bloodstream, so their effects are a bit broader. Oxytocin is that bonding love hormone, and endorphins, they're basically our body's natural morphine.
All right, so we've talked a lot about the problems. Let's pivot and talk about solutions. Welcome to Section 4, Pathways to Feeling Better. This is all about the what now, from things you can do in the moment to long-term treatments.
If you're ever in a moment where you're feeling really anxious and spiraling, here is a super simple, super powerful technique to ground yourself. It's called the 3-3-3 rule. All you do is look around and name 3 things you can see. Then, listen carefully for 3 distinct sounds. And finally, move 3 different parts of your body. It sounds simple, but it's incredibly effective at pulling you back into the present moment.
What about medication? How do common antidepressants, like SSRIs, actually work? Well, it's a 2-part process. First, yes, they help increase the amount of serotonin that's available in your brain. But just as important, they actually encourage your brain to grow new connections, to physically change its wiring. And that physical change, that rewiring process, is the big reason why these medications can take a few weeks before you feel their full effect.
So, what's the most effective strategy? Medication? Therapy? Well, the data is pretty clear on this one. Studies show that, yeah, medication alone can help. And therapy alone can often be even better. But the absolute best outcomes, they come from combining the two. Medication and therapy working together is the most powerful approach we have.
And for our final section, we're going to zoom all the way out. Section 5, Beyond the Individual Mind. Because our mental health isn't just about what's happening inside our own heads, it's also shaped by our families, our genes, and the world around us.
I know this might seem like a strange place to start, but this simple line from a Disney movie, it's actually a perfect modern-day example of a really complex concept in psychiatry.
The movie Encanto is this incredible illustration of what psychiatrists call transgenerational trauma. Think about it. The family matriarch goes through this horrific event. So, to protect her family from that pain, she creates all these rules and expectations. But in doing so, she accidentally passes the trauma down to the younger generations, who never even experienced the original event themselves.
And what about our DNA? We know for a fact that conditions like schizophrenia have a strong genetic link. For example, if one identical twin has it, the other has a 50% chance of developing it too. But hold on, look closer at that number. That also means there's a 50% chance they won't. That tells us something else is going on. It means that environmental factors can actually turn on or turn off certain genes. And that is the amazing field of epigenetics.
And that brings us to this really powerful final thought. Your genes are not your destiny. You might hear people say, genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And that leaves us with one last question for you to think about. What in your environment is shaping you? Thanks for watching.